and we still got a couple people popping in, but I think we'll go ahead and introduce Jenni. Again, just so pleased to have Jenni with us. Jenni Sorkin is an associate professor of history of art and architecture at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She writes on the intersections between gender, material culture, and contemporary art, working primarily on women artists and underrepresented media. Her publications include Live Form, Women, Ceramics, and Community, Revolution in the Making, Abstract Sculpture by Women Artists, 1947 to 2016, the forthcoming Art in California, and numerous essays in journals and exhibition catalogs. She was educated at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, Bard College, and received her PhD from Yale University. She's a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Modern Craft. And I have been a longtime admirer of Jenni's writing, and I'm just, again, so feeling very fortunate to have her tonight and to have so many wonderful people joining us for this lecture. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Jenni. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me here, Andy. I'm very pleased to speak this evening at the University of Iowa. I do wish it were in person. I would really like to get on a plane, but that's not possible right now. But what is really amazing is to have this whole crowd of practitioners and artists, and this talk is really aimed at all of you. I have not written an argument-driven talk. This is really about sort of a kind of statement of my own trajectory, ceramics, history, and the work I'm doing now. So thank you so much for making this possible. And thank you everybody out there for coming. It's really amazing to see so many familiar names and faces. Well, I don't see your faces yet, but I will. When you put questions in the chat, when I start my PowerPoint, I won't be able to see them, but I will see them when I get out of it at the end. So please add them. Comments too are great. All right, without further ado, thank you again for having me and for being here. And I'm gonna go ahead and get started. Please ignore my messy desktop. Slideshow. Okay, can you all see this? Andy, can you see this? Yeah, okay. Great.
So far deep into.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about feminist and proto-feminist ceramics and materiality in general this evening. As you see here, I've opened with a kind of amazing slide of Annabeth Rosen's studio, which is in Davis, California. You can see all of her accruals or accumulations of the multi-partite works that she makes and then puts together. But this is going to be very West Coast heavy. I will give you that because that is the work I'm doing and that is where I'm currently located. So just to give you a kind of overview of where I teach and where I'm at in terms of my career is I teach at a major research university, the University of California, Santa Barbara. But part of why I am so eager and excited to speak to all of you tonight as artists and ceramic artists and sculptors and crafts people of all stripes or craft trained artists, however you'd like to designate yourself, is because I teach at a campus that excised its ceramics program many, many years ago, all the way back in 1983. And what you're looking at here is both the beauty of my campus and also its deficit is that you're looking at the table of contents of the UCSB Rec Center, where you can go take martial arts classes and jump rope for fitness, and you can learn to surf. And this is the only place where you can learn to throw, is in this rec center, in a small pottery studio, next to the small weaving studio, next to the climbing wall. This is where ceramics has been demoted on my campus. It is essentially a recreation. It is a self-exploration. You cannot get credit for doing it here. It's considered sort of personal enrichment. And so in that sense, it is no longer an accredited program. And it is discouraged to the extent that we do have a computational craft professor who was recently hired in the art department, Sarah Rosalina Brady, and I'm very glad to have her here on my team, but it is not the same thing, I think, in terms of being able to learn how to throw on the wheel, make coils, do any of that kind of, learn to fire in a kiln. None of that is possible here. And so I really love being invited elsewhere where there are craft trained artists, and there is a dedicated ceramics program, because I feel that that kind of skilled work is so important. And I can't have those conversations on my own campus with artists. What I do get to do is, and people always ask me, why don't you teach in an art department? I teach in an art history department. And the joy of teaching in an art history department is that I feel very much I'm at the forefront of training a crop of PhD students who will go back to university or college teaching and be able to actually train craft trained artists how to think about craft history. And that really excites me on a daily basis. So I have 9 PhD students right now. I'm the only American academic training PhD students in dedicated craft history. I only have 2, I have a range of them, but I have 2 specifically working on ceramics. So I just want to give a shout out to them and their projects. Matthew Lim, who is a 6th year PhD candidate, who is both a loose ACLS predoctoral fellow right now and will be a Smithsonian fellow in the fall. He's writing a dissertation called Living on the Edge, Ceramics and the Environment in the American West. And you see this great Edith Heath double exposure image that is representing his dissertation. I also have Sarah Morris, a 4th year PhD candidate who is embarking on a dissertation called Figurative Sculpture and the Crafting of Identity in Post-War American Art, 1960 to 1990. She will be a Renwick predoctoral fellow at the Smithsonian starting in the fall. And this will really be one of the first iterations of re-looking at the history of figurative work, and in particular women's work. And you see here a Patty Warashina sculpture, and then Patty Warashina on the right with her motorcycle and her baby and her iron, a cool grouping of symbols and sort of iconic stance about being a kind of proto-feminist in the late 60s. Up in Washington State. So one of the things that I've really encouraged my students to do is think about West Coast history. This is because there are a whole lot of East Coast art historians who traipse to the West Coast and dabble in California histories, West Coast histories, and then go back to the East, and they think they understand what they're doing. And I'm trying to acknowledge that my students are here, that they can work through histories that are all around them, and also introduce our public school students, many of whom are community college transfers, first generation college students. Many of my graduate students, both Sarah and Matt, are both first generation college students, that you can work non-canonically. You can work outside of and underneath the radar. You can work on materials, histories, and objects that have not been written about before. And to that end, I have been writing for the last 2.5 years this book called Art in California, which is forthcoming in the fall. It was supposed to be out last month. Due to COVID, it didn't print on time, but it will be out in September. And you're seeing here the first iteration of the cover image, and then just the table of contents, so you have a sense of how I've organized this. This is an entire 20th century history. I did not start, even though I'm a post-war specialist and I largely work post-1960, I decided to go back to the beginning of the century and try to offer something comprehensive that people could teach with, that was going to be incredibly intersectional and showcase kind of lost, forgotten, or overlooked histories of many non-white people, Japanese American photographers who were working pre-concentration camp on the West Coast, to Mexican muralists who came in the 30s, to the kind of social movements and political histories of the 60s. in chapter 4 you see. What you will notice is that there is no dedicated studio craft chapter. And that was one of my main goals, was to actually get and reinsert the history of American studio craft in California back into modernism. It's usually left out. We never get any kind of comprehensive introduction to histories of ceramics in traditional painting and sculpture art history. And so that was also one of the main thrusts of this book. What I decided to do ultimately was weave that history through every single chapter. So instead of holding craft aloft and by itself and to its 5 designated media, it shows up throughout every single chapter. And I'm very proud of that. And I'm very proud of separating those histories from one another and teasing them apart. So for instance, all of the textile material is not with the ceramics. I have dumped it into the feminist chapter because I really feel that textile history in California is incredibly feminist. So those are the kinds of things I've done within this book that I'm pretty proud of, and I hope you all read it, and perhaps those of you who are on the West Coast or elsewhere can find a way to teach with it. That's my real goal here. Okay, moving on. Okay, I am not from California, although I'd be very happy if I was, but I'm a transplant from Chicago. I first came to California at the age of 24 to work on this major exhibition with the curator Connie Butler, who is currently the chief curator of the Hammer Museum at UCLA, who was working at the Museum of Contemporary Art Los Angeles on this show called WAC, Art in the Feminist Revolution. I started this project as an intern. I came back after I'd completed my master's degree at Center for Curatorial Studies, Bard College. And I moved to California to work with her on this amazing history of feminism in the 70s that was really untapped at the time, and that had not been reconsidered in the museum. Now we have a lot of feminist artists who have entered into museum collections, but at the time that was not the case. And there was a lot of skepticism about putting together a major show like this, how you designated international artists versus regional artists versus local artists in California, because feminism was so prominent in the 70s on the West Coast. And how you held the number down, because there was only so much space. You could not do a comprehensive show. We ended up with 120 artists, but that easily could have doubled to 240, or it could have tripled, because there are so many women, amazing women artists working throughout that decade. One of the major contributions I feel I made to the show was not just in the research, but also in pointing Connie toward pieces like this that you see here at the top, Magdalena Bakanovich's Red Abacon, which became one of the iconic shots of the interior of the show. I had come out of a fiber program as an undergraduate at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. So I fell into ceramics history later, but I really started out as a fiber artist. And because I had trained at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, I had been taught by an amazing roster of teachers like Ann Wilson and Joan Livingstone, who introduced me to an alternative modernism that I didn't know existed at the time, and that I carried with me into museum work and into art history, because I felt like I was learning this canon that didn't include any of these material histories or processes or traditions. But this exhibition was really sort of my own feminist awakening happened during the process of working on this show. And museum shows like this take a really long time to come to fruition. This show did not open till 2007. I started working on it in 2001. That's a whole 6 years until it actually comes to fruition and becomes a real show. I left toward the end and went back to graduate school at Yale to get a doctorate, because I decided that I really did want to do art history, and I wanted to continue to research and be committed to uncovering sort of underserved women artists who had not gotten proper recognition or their due in some way. So two of the artists that I'm just going to pull out of this show are artists who were really committed to anti-form, or forms of abstraction and formlessness. And that's one of the big strains across WAC, is a commitment to abstraction. One of these artists, Linda Banglis, was known for these pour paintings that were included on the left, but also these formless sort of heaps or masses that drip and yet are bronzed or made out of lead or somehow cast in a metallic material that's completely solid and immobile, but takes on the quality of abstraction and formlessness. And yet it turns out that what's missing here for me, and in the kind of art historical terms of thinking through formlessness, or what we would call on form, is the kind of theoretical term in art history that Yves Allenbois and Rosalind Krauss come to in this very famous Formless, a User's Guide that shows up on every single modernist art historian's bibliography. Many of you in art school
constantly say no, but we continue to ask. And if they were all sitting in front of me, I'd ask the same question.
Oh, somebody's got their
Just somebody's helping.
We're working on it.
Somebody. That's okay. The other one is Sculpture in the Expanded Field, which many people, it's a kind of canonical essay from October that Krauss writes in '79. But what is missing in both of these iterations of formlessness is ceramics. And ceramic artists know themselves that clay itself is a formless material. It is a huge mass and crushing weight that has to be formed, shaped, beat into submission. And that to me is a kind of massive overlooking demotion and hierarchy that's put into place by modernist art history, in that these major projects purposefully ignore the traditions and histories of ceramics. So just to give a kind of brief recap here, because I'm going to use this term studio pottery to give you a working definition. Most of you know this, but just in case. What is studio pottery? It is ceramics that encompasses both pottery and sculpture. It is where the craftsperson controls the process of making from start to finish entirely by their own hand in the studio, hence the designation studio pottery. It usually means that the craftsperson historically is also entrepreneurial in spirit, in that they make, fire, and also sell their wares, usually out of a small boutique, or figure out how to self-market or enter into exhibitions. It is both functional and non-functional. What I've learned in my research is that this is not an either or. Most artists of the mid-20th century who were throwing pottery were also simultaneously often participating in sculptural work. It was a kind of simultaneity of abstraction in form, but also skilled making of the vessel tradition, or making tableware or dinnerware, making cookware like casseroles or stock pots or covered dishes, making sculptural vessels like vases, and then making all out non-functional sculpture. To return to Linda Banglis for a moment, one of the other interesting sidebars or through lines here of her own formlessness and her own introduction to making large-scale sculpture is that she had a woman art teacher, which was an incredible rarity in the mid-century. Ida Kohlmeyer was her kind of Louisiana abstract expressionist who did show in New York and had a New York career, but largely made her living as a teacher. She was Linda's teacher at Newcomb, the Newcomb College, which is now part of Tulane University in New Orleans. These are a couple of images of her work. You can see the kind of abstract expressionist and also investment in color, bright color, and sort of zany forms that I think Linda picked up on in her own work. Newcomb pottery, which is what precedes Newcomb College, which was an all-women's college in the Deep South that precedes Tulane University itself, which is a coeducational facility now, or University. Newcomb Pottery was one of the premier spaces in which women could learn skills and gain the skills to work outside of the home and make money. This was for usually middle and upper middle class young women from the South. They came to college at Newcomb Pottery. They began to learn how to China paint starting in the late 19th century. This is one of the premier spots of the arts and crafts movement in the South. And what you see here is all of these very well-dressed women glazing and painting at their at big tables. And you see a kind of master potter here who's a man. This is purposeful because there was a split legacy in that women were not actually able to or encouraged to throw their own ceramics. They did not learn how to work on the wheel. They did not learn how to wedge. They did not learn actually how to handle the clay. They were demoted to being china painters and to being decorators. And so since we see that there's a double designation here in that the woman, Harriet Jure, is the artist, but Joseph Meyer, who is the potter. And so there's a kind of constancy even into the 1930s until the pottery itself closes in 1940, that women are not brought into the process of sculpting, moving, handling clay. They are simply china painters working on the surface, but they're also propelling forward the kind of aesthetics of Newcomb itself. This is one of the major kind of moss draped moon designs that Sadie Irvine markets, and this becomes quite famous and one of the major souvenirs that you can acquire from Newcomb. You can mail away for it. There were a number of famous New York people who owned versions of this pot, and it became a kind of collectible in the Depression era moment. Another version of arts and crafts pottery in the North is the Paul Revere Pottery in Boston, which hosted what was called the Saturday Evening Girls Club between 1908 and 1942. And they also decorated and were china painters. They also were not throwing, but I'm pointing out this pottery in particular because there's a kind of moment here of extreme social control in which wealthy white Bostonian women put out this social club for young immigrant girls, mostly Italian and Irish immigrants, to offer them skills and offer them a place to go on Saturday nights so that they would not do things like get themselves pregnant. So there's an element of, we might say, a kind of hierarchy that's put into place, racialized hierarchy in Boston at the time, and people did order from the Paul Revere Pottery, and this work was sold. Were these women paid for their contribution? I'm not sure, but this is another kind of arts and crafts era moment of well-meaning white Christian women who are controlling the immigrant population through ceramics, through labor, through craft pottery. This leads us to the lack of social control, or the willful throwing off of social control. In the work of, for instance, Hannah Wilkie, who you see here, is another artist coming out of WAC who had a background, although it was not necessarily publicized, in ceramics. This is a grouping called Sweet 16 of painted fired earthenware, shaped like the folds of the vagina or the labia, or like little flowers. They're quite beautiful, and this shape reoccurs again and again in her work in various media, particularly abject media like chewed gum. She makes what she calls little cunts. This is a terminology throughout the 70s. It's really embraced by feminist artists who are trying to revalue and rediscover their own body and its importance and assert its power. She also does this in laundry lint, which I really love. arranged, again, the cunts in a kind of grid-like pattern on the floor at the Neuberger Museum in a big retrospective that was done in 2008. You see this again in what is maybe one of her most famous images, the SOS Starification object series, in which she literally desecrates her body with these little chewed gum sculptures that appear at the bottom in a photographic grid-like fashion, in which she's, as a beautiful woman, kind of purposefully creating or making herself warded or pimpled through this kind of gum, chewing, mastication, desiccation, all of these really bodily kinds of interactions of the mouth and scarring the body. I had mentioned that Hannah Wilke had studied ceramics. This was her ceramics teacher at the Tyler School of Art at Temple University. This is where she learns to work in ceramics. Early in, actually in the late 50s, she studies with Rudolf Staffel or Rudy Staffel, who is, makes later on in life these kind of amazing porcelain pieces in which he was trying to create translucency through porcelain through this series called Light Gatherer, in which the porcelain almost is illuminated if you shine a light on it because it's thrown so thin. Annabeth Rosen is an artist, a ceramic sculptor based in Davis, California, who also taught at Tyler in the late 1980s into the early 90s. I mention her because she is a kind of legacy of early on a woman artist who was not in a tenure track position for most of her early career here at Tyler, but worked in Philadelphia for a long time as a Philadelphia artist and eventually comes to California to teach at UC Davis. I'm pointing out that she's actually one of the only female professors in an endowed chairship. And this chairship at Davis is named for Robert Arneson. This is a really big deal in the ceramics field because this field has been so male dominant and also so misogynist in terms of recognizing and valuing its women artists. Just to point out an Arneson image that I think is incredibly evocative and also incredibly gendered. This is an early piece of his called Typewriter. I really love this piece because of its bad gender politics. What we have here is women's painted nails that replace the keys on the keyboard, lending itself to a kind of typology of women as pink collar laborers doing secretarial work, that the typewriter itself becomes a gendered object that is wholly female in its operations and in its manual labor. Kathy Butterly, who I know many of you are big fans of because I heard today during studio visits her name mentioned a number of times, is considered Robert Arneson's last student at Davis before he retired. She's an artist who makes these exquisite, heavily glazed pieces that are working at a small scale. They're vessel constructions, and they are kind of collapsed in on themselves often in a sculptural fashion. Many of them have small pedestals attached to them. This was a recent show done at Shoshana Wayne Gallery in Los Angeles called Yellow Haze. She's also been recently working, doing a bunch of drawings I've seen with lacquered nail polish, which is a kind of perhaps another feminine gesture of working out her own glaze chemistries in lacquer, in another medium, we might say. So this is the big question. I've shown you a couple of contemporary artists, but this becomes an issue for me that I want to address, which is why go backward as an art historian and not forward in time? This is one of the things that I think is really difficult about, or sort of disenfranchises artists from art historians, is that I feel that artists are always moving forward in their momentum. They're always working on the next project. They don't always want to revisit. They get kind of impatient sometimes if you ask them about something they did 10 or 15 or 50 years ago. They don't remember, they don't care. Why don't they care? Of course they care, but they're moving forward. They're really excited about what they're doing now or what they're doing tomorrow. Art historians, on the other hand, are thinking about history always and are always moving backward and thinking about how the past informs the present and the future. And so I feel that these trajectories are opposite in certain ways. And I feel very fortunate that I was trained to think initially as an artist. It's informed how I work as an art historian. And I feel like I can work somewhere in the middle here, but I do see the hangups in both ways. The other thing that I think is really difficult in craft departments or craft training is that there is a constant mismatch in the university and in art schools in that artists who are teaching craft disciplines are also forced to become their own historian. There is nobody on the faculty ever who can teach ceramics history, who can teach textile history, who can teach woodworking history. That doesn't exist. That's what I'm seeking to change through the channels of PhD students, is putting craft historians back into the university so that there is a much richer and deeper conversation possible between art historians and artists who are often in the same building and yet completely estranged from each other in terms of their interests and conversations. Some of the other artists who come out of California, and I wanted to sort of touch on this figurative tradition that my student Sarah Morris is working on, but also to really think about the issues of gender that crop up in issues of thinking through figuration and the body. These are objects also small in scale, like Kathy Butterly, made by Kawil Hooven, who is a Berkeley-based artist who's pretty under-recognized for the most part. She was a student of David Shaner, who is a Montana potter at the University of Illinois when he taught there briefly, and she eventually flips coasts and moves to Berkeley, even though she's born in New York. She's making these small scale porcelain figurines. She's always working in white and china blue. And so they are bisqued and glazed, but it's a kind of clear glaze. She's interested in the figure and the shape and the form, less so the glaze chemistry, which I think is really interesting to see the kind of delicacy with which she's making figures. This piece, The Last Straw, reminds me quite a lot of Louise Bourgeois' Spiral Woman, which is done in bronze, also at a small scale and hangs from the ceiling in this really evocative sort of mobile in which a woman is literally at the end of her rope, covered up, has no facial features, and yet is sort of dangling in space, spiraling perhaps out of control, because we know that this hook allows for a kind of movement or turning. I think that there's a real connection here to the off-kilter quality of Hooven's The Last Straw. What's really also interesting about Hooven is that she has a deep connection to ceramics history. Her great aunt was Mary Louise McLaughlin, who was a Cincinnati potter in the arts and crafts movement. Here is her vase that resides in the Metz collection from 1880. She never met her. She dies the same year that Hooven is born, but Hooven as an artist really feels that this is a kind of cemented legacy that she's working through in her own work, paying tribute to Mary Louise McLaughlin, who never really got her due. She was the ultimate rival of Maria Longworth Nichols, who had founded the Rookwood pottery in Cincinnati. And they were kind of technical rivals their entire careers from within Cincinnati. So there's a kind of interesting story there. Just to show you a couple more Hooven images, which are really wrapped up in the scale of domesticity, child raising, the feminine body, issues of sexuality and the burden of marriage, we might say, particularly in this piece, The Couple, in which the woman's eyes are blinded and covered by this clothing or domestic labor, the difference in size here between the man and the woman, the bodiless head figures, the cerebrality of overthinking in relationships, we might say, the beauty of this pillow that has these little figurines on top, almost like a storybook at night that you're reading to children. There's a figurative tradition all over California and all over the West Coast. We have Viola Frey, who makes really large-scale figurative pieces, both men and women, but primarily women. Here's double grandmothers in black and white dresses. Or the kind of strange realities of Tip Tolland, an artist working in Seattle. This piece called Grace Flirts, which is really quite disturbing, with this almost circus mouth standing on what looks like the end of the edge or the diving board, or being on edge, or conveying some kind of psychological state of distress or despair. We have Beatrice Wood, an artist who is kind of a double-edged sword, in the sense that she's making both figurative objects and really beautiful abstract vessel constructions, which I'll show you in a moment. Here's one of my favorite late works of hers called Career Women, in which these naked ladies are standing happily on top of a man who is maybe they've stomped to death, or he's sleeping, but he's in a prone, submissive position. And there's something triumphant about them standing on top as a threesome, as though they have somehow triumphed over the patriarchy. I think that this work has a lot in common with, for instance, Ruby Neary's work. She's a contemporary ceramic artist who started her career as a graffiti artist in San Francisco and has since transferred into making ceramics nearly full time. This is a piece called Woman Flying Away from earlier this year, with these tropes and symbols of femininity, like hearts and these lozenges and the pink, and almost, the pink pubic area and the prominent nipples reminds me quite a lot of this sort of prone man, but in a different configuration. Beatrice Wood was trained by the Knotzlers. This is how she learned how to make glazes and how to throw. Gertrude Knotzler and Otto Knotzler were a couple who came, they were Jewish emigres who came from Austria to Los Angeles pre-war. They came in 1938 and they worked together. He had a chemistry background, she was the thrower. So this is the opposite configuration of the way American arts and crafts potteries were set up, where women did not touch or handle clay and men were the throwers. This is opposite, and I really like it for that reason. He did the glazes, she did the throwing, and made these really delicate, beautiful forms that were never meant to be used. They're showpieces, like this large teardrop bottle, or this earthenware volcanic glaze that Otto Knotzler comes up with. He's a really great glaze chemist. Beatrice Wood learns from him, and then they later on accuse her of stealing their glaze chemistries, and they stop talking to her. So this is one of the other interesting things in ceramics, is the early propriety that happens in terms of secrecy of glazes and people getting mad at each other and sort of having falling outs over this betrayal, because American ceramics in the 30s and 40s and even into the 50s is at this early pioneering stage where they have to remake the field because nobody has any knowledge. The Knotzlers are considered the people who taught everybody in LA how to throw on a kick wheel. They brought with them from Europe. Nobody was using wheel throwing at this point. They were the main teachers of reintroducing wheel throwing to the West Coast. And here are several Beatrice Wood footed bowls, chalice-like in their luster. And here's one that's a kind of volcanic glaze again. Here's an image of Beatrice Wood. She lives till 105. She lives the entirety of the 20th century and beyond, which is pretty amazing. She works out of Ojai, California. She starts her career in Paris. She's from San Francisco. She's kind of dilettante figure who goes to Paris to act, comes back to the States, is part of Duchamp's circle in New York, but doesn't really get going in her own work till she discovers ceramics. And that doesn't happen really in a serious way until she's deep into her 60s. And she just gets better and better once she commits to this medium. You see these kind of amazing luster works that are both campy and beautiful. They're like Catholic relics or sort of showpieces on a stage. There's something incredibly theatrical about them. And this might be unknown to many of you, but I think it's a great fun fact. She is the person that James Cameron bases The Old Woman on in his epic 1996 film, The Titanic. She is who Gloria Stewart ends up playing. He goes to visit her shortly before she passes, and she becomes the kind of iconic figure that he bases that free spirit of Rose on. And so I love that connection to ceramics because it's such an iconic pop cultural movie that so many people saw in the 90s and became a touchstone for a lot of young women. I'm going to turn now just briefly to my book, Live Form. I mentioned that I was really interested in working backward in a way. After WAC and going to graduate school, I sort of was on the precipice of, do I move forward or do I move back? And I decided to go backward, which is why I went back to school, was so that I could really research in depth the generation that comes before all of the feminists, really the generation right after Beatrice Wood's generation, which are the craftspeople who do not consider themselves feminist, but had a kind of bohemianism and avant-gardism and autonomy in their lifestyle that led them to become what we would call proto-feminist. They lived like feminists, even though they weren't, and they did not call themselves feminists, but they made their own money and they made their own lifestyle choices. And so that is what I spend my time doing at Yale, is working toward this dissertation, which becomes my first book, Live Form, which a number of you at Iowa read for part of for today. And so just to go over this, the primary methodologies out of this book are really reworking ceramics as performance-driven rather than object-driven, thinking through ceramics as a form of gendered labor, both pedagogical and aesthetic. It was I really wanted to use biography and a biography of process as one of the primary methodologies, and thinking through a lot of the primary source archives I had encountered in doing archival research at the museum for WAC that had nowhere to go. There is nowhere to put primary source research in museum exhibition catalogs. That was a kind of bitter lesson I learned out of museum culture, which is that there's no place for deep research. Everything moves, even though it's a glacial pace to get a show on the wall, it doesn't move quite slow enough to do deep-seated research that you can really incorporate into long scholarly works. And lastly, the outsider status, the perennial outsider status of craft and ceramics in particular, in that there's a kind of ongoing outsiderness in which ceramics stands beside all of these modernist traditions that are also at the time outside of sculpture, like video art, and yet video art enters the canon in a way that ceramics never does. And so I was very curious about trying to diagnose why that was, which is what I do throughout this book, but largely in the introduction. So this is just to show you that art historians also have a process. And this is to show you my process of titles briefly. And all the title configurations I went through with this project over a nearly 8-year period until it actually saw publication. So I started writing this book as a dissertation in 2007, and it doesn't get published until 2016. So that's about nearly a decade of working toward something. I end up with Live Form, Women's Ceramics and Community. The publisher nixes any of these dates. I was really married to, for a while, the Rural Avant-Garde, and I will, at some point use that title again, but it never quite fit this project. And so this ends up the last title, but you can see that I did go through a whole process here. I was really committed to thinking through pedagogy and the histories of teaching. I'm showing this in particular because I'm talking in Iowa tonight. This is an image that I gleaned from Luther College's archives in Decorah, Iowa. And this is the kind of deep research that I'm talking about. I went to a lot of secondary archives to track sources in this book project. Margaret Wildenhain's main papers are at the Archives of American Art, but it turns out Luther College, which is a small Lutheran college in northern Iowa, actually has a much better, richer archive. And it's because her last studio assistant taught there. And on the precipice of her death, he inherited her papers, and this is where they were deposited. So it was kind of random, but amazing that they have and have cataloged everything properly and are quite proud of having a number of her objects and portions of her own personal collection. The other thing I want to point out is that there's a lot of false starts in a project like this. What you're seeing here is an early image of Karen Carnes, who I was really committed to writing about. I love Karen Carnes' work. I think she's an amazing artist. I love her history at Black Mountain College. I tracked her down and took a summer class at Haystack. In 2006, I slogged through a week-long ceramics class. I only say it's a slog because I'm not good at ceramics. I don't want to be a potter. I want to write about pottery and ceramics and support all of you because there's not enough people doing it. And there's a lot of mediocre potters, and I don't need to be another one. I don't even think I'd be as good as mediocre. But I took this class with her in the hopes that she would talk to me because she wasn't answering any of my letters. And by the last day, she sat down and said, okay, you've sat through the class. What do you want to know? And I asked her a bunch of questions, and I told her I wanted to write a chapter of my dissertation on her. And I was so crushed when she told me no. And I said, why? And she said, because you're not a potter. You don't really know. You don't really understand my life, and I want somebody who does. And so she had already pre-appointed Mark Shapiro, who co-taught the class with her, who is a remarkably smart potter and writer, a functional potter. And he ended up doing her major retrospective show and sort of holds the key to her papers and thinking about her work and livelihood. I still love her work. I think she was a feisty soul, but I was briefly crushed, not even briefly. It took me a while to get over the fact that I wasn't going to be able to include her in my dissertation. And so that was one of my early sort of false starts. And I'm sharing that with all of you because I think it's important that you see that these failures somehow have to be reworked. And as artists, you all know that, and you're all good at it. And you're better than the art historians, I promise you. Karen Carnes is also why I ended up working on MC Richards. I was following the sort of lead of Black Mountain's trail. MC ended up being a much more important force in the book. As a queer woman, I was secretly hoping that they were lovers. That was one of my working theories. Karen Carnes ends up with a woman later in life, although she doesn't identify or self-identify as a lesbian. We can say now that she was a queer figurehead. MC Richards was very straight. That was very disappointing to me. Another false start, but I was very happy to write about her nonetheless. Did I want to have a queer woman in my book? Of course. Could I find one at that moment? No. So I let that go. But just to tell you, I was really looking hard. MC Richards is trained by Peter Volkus at Black Mountain. She goes back, even though she's taught as an English professor there, she goes back to study with him. They become very good friends. He introduces her to pottery. She introduces him to the New York avant-garde by taking him to New York for the first time and introducing him to John Cage. But Peter Volkus has a woman lurking in his background, and he is trained at Montana State by Frances Senska. who has studied with Marguerite Wildenhain and Moholy Nagy at IIT in Chicago, and all of these other luminary modernists, but is really under-recognized in our field. And so I'm just in these last few minutes gonna go through a kind of litany of women who have been basically left out of ceramics history or overlooked or forgotten. Martha Longnecker, who was a San Diego potter who started the ceramics program at San Diego State University, but goes on to establish the Mingue International Museum, which still exists today in Balboa Park in San Diego. Very devoted to the idea of the vernacular or artisan or anonymous craftsperson, which Mingue stems from a Japanese ceramics tradition. Dora Delarios, who is an LA potter, one of the only Chicana women working during the 1950s. She studies at University of Southern California with Susan Peterson. I love this image of her sitting in her kiln. Laura Andresen, who is the queer potter I was looking for at the time, but didn't know it, who taught at UCLA as the first woman on the arts faculty, starting in 1933. Her rival across town was Glenn Lukens, who was himself a gay man, who started the ceramics program at USC. They had kind of a rivalry around glaze chemistry, just like Beatrice Wood and the Knotzlers. And I'm gonna stop there. I'm happy to talk, take questions, comments. Thank you so much, but there's a lot of work to do in this field. And so I'd like to end on that note of optimism that many people will go on to do some of this work.
Thank you so much, Jenny. That was excellent. If you participants want to start your videos, we're happy to have a discussion, and you can use the raise hand function, and then I can click through to have questions occur. There are a couple in the chat already. Before we do that, I put this in the chat, but I just wanted to emphasize that Jenny has kindly offered to come on Thursday night as well, and in partnership with the Stanley Museum of Art here on campus, participate in an object study with Joyce Tsai, who's our chief curator. And the Zoom link is in the chat. You're all welcome to come back for that as well. And I believe you're going to be discussing some Miriam Shapiro pieces that are in the collection. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay. So that Zoom info is in the chat. So there's a question already that I'll just read here, and this is from Rose Schreiber-Stainthorpe. She says, I have some questions relating to live form. There's a passage that comes at the very beginning of the book, literally on page 1 to 2, that I was wondering if you could dig into a bit. Here's the passage. The art/craft divide is better understood politically rather than aesthetically. Craft is most often linked to fiscal policy, a redistribution of labor, production, and skill resulting in improved economic conditions, while avant-garde is linked to social policy and its ensuing debates of morality.
Sure. I'm happy to dig into the quote. The basic idea is that there's a craft fine arts divide historically. And what I am making the argument that the divide is related to is not about medium, but about the way craft circulates versus the way fine arts circulates. And craft, when I say is linked to fiscal policy, it means that there's been many initiatives globally to use craft as a kind of cottage industry and create places for skilled labor to flourish, which means craft is linked to a political and fiscal economy, whereas fine arts or so-called avant-garde art like painting and sculpture does not have that kind of skill involved related to teaching people how to be entrepreneurial and make a living. That is never done globally. And when I say it's instead linked to social policy, what I mean is that the fine arts becomes linked to histories of morality and concerns around ethics, whether or not something deserves censorship, for instance, whether it's too nude, whether it's too outrageous. And that would be, I think, the primary difference, that instead of understanding craft versus fine arts or craft versus art as a divide that's about mediums and hierarchy of mediums, rather we should think of it as related to economics and labor versus morality debates. I think it's a better methodology. So that's what I'm trying to introduce in my book.
There was also a second part to that I saw after I read the first part that says, after reading Live Form, I also wondered whether you felt this focus on performance and process was unique to the medium of ceramics, or whether it's a lens that can be applied to all fields.
That's a really good question, Rose. I do believe it is applicable to all craft fields, that there is a performative quality to any kind of contemporary craft production. You could make the same arguments around glass, for instance. Anyone else? Somebody named Rachel Wollert, Kobler-Wollert has questions, but she didn't put them in the chat. I'm happy to call on her.
Yeah, I wanted to actually talk to you, face to face, quote unquote. And just say that one, I've been a fan of yours for a long time. Two, I am also in the process of a graduate program and thinking about future work, future careers in teaching craft in art history programs, teaching craft in museums, doing all of that stuff. So yeah, I may have a separate email to you to discuss all of that, because yeah, PhD possibly in the future. So I'm looking at
that seems more of like a one-on-one conversation.
Yeah. I think I'll go with one question that I'm really working through right now. And this kind of relates to the way that art historians do the looking backward process and artists do the looking forward process. But I'm doing kind of a thesis formulation right now of looking at birth and death narratives within art historiography. And I see that we have scholars like Glenn Adamson, who writes on the invention of craft as sort of this very particular kind of mode of thinking out of industrial revolution and all of that. And then I also see that Garth Clark, as a gallerist and working more in the art market, writes on kind of the death of crafts, but a very specific type of not even craft, but craft market, I guess. I was wondering if you know of or have seen any other examples where craft makers or craft scholars have brought up these kinds of birth and death narratives, and how that progression comes about in thinking craft in general.
I think that's a big question. I think it requires a big bibliography, which you're probably working through now in a thesis.
Yeah.
I can't think of anybody offhand, but I think that there's many inroads to craft. Folk art has been one of the major ones, thinking about anthropology has been another inroad in craft. There has been a number of disciplines in which craft figures heavily that are adjacent to arts disciplines and are much more expansive in the humanities. There's even a sociologist who writes, Gary Allen Fine, F-I-N-E, who writes about histories of the outsider art market that include craft work in there. And he's just looking at how to think about art outsider art or sort of self-trained artists, we might say, in an economical way, thinking about economics of their production. So I think that there's a lot of ways into what you're talking about. It's not just two authors. But it's a good topic.
Thanks. Yeah.
Anyone else?
Got another question showing up in the chat here from Robert. If you'd like to ask it, Robert, you can.
Can I go ahead or?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, go for it.
Okay, so you brought up something that was really interesting, is that you were talking about studio ceramics programs teaching their own ceramic history, because that wasn't available as part of the bigger art historical conversation. And I
Still
think
not available.
Still not available. Yes. So when I was in school, which was a long time ago now, I had the pleasure of studying with Jackie Rice, who wound up teaching me a lot about the history of decorative art, along with ceramics. And we had a formal ceramics history class as a part of the undergraduate program, but also sort of this history of decorative arts, and led to conversations about the P&D movement. And also through her, I learned a lot about the Wiener Werkstatt. And I wonder if there's a connection between the history of decorative art and ceramics that's taught in those studio programs that has led to that connection through time. And also as an artist, I often find myself in conversations with other artists who don't know about those histories as much as people don't know about the history of ceramics per se. And I'm wondering if you see that connection between those two realms, like P&D, other forms of craft history, something like the Wiener Werkstatt era, but also if it also affects still sort of how ceramics has entered the contemporary art world, like in the art market, where often in the beginning when ceramics was becoming popular, this idea, it was often talked more about immediacy and the material versus craft and skilled craft use of the material, where it was more, people were more excited about this thing that you could just squeeze and touch, and that's how it entered into the art world popularity. I guess that's all of my question.
I think that's a really good point. You're making a connection between sort of decorative arts histories, which is certainly where ceramics is situated in the big encyclopedic museums. That is the ancient to contemporary museums like the Met or the Philadelphia Museum of Art or the Art Institute of Chicago. Encyclopedic, big, not just specializing in the contemporary. Certainly that is where the craft disciplines are still found, and that is where contemporary craft often resides. So for instance, there was a jewelry collector several years ago who left her entire collection, unfortunately, to the Met, where it will be buried in storage, and no one will see it. And if it had gone to a craft-specific museum or to a contemporary museum or a place like MAD, the Museum of Art and Design, it would have gotten a lot more play. Instead, it went on view briefly. They did a short catalog to, for the collector's sake, because she was still alive. And now it's just sitting there. But yes, so I think that the decorative arts has been a way to separate out histories of contemporary making. And then the problem that you're identifying, the contemporary craftsperson, we have the problem of de-skilled clay or de-skilled craft, in which the de-skilling, which I think is what you're talking about in terms of play, that people who come to ceramics with skill are often devalued in a way that artists who are playing with clay, they like its squishy qualities, they're making amateur pots, they're using, pottery in a way that's about social practice. Somebody like the Esther Gates, we might say, is a kind of de-skilled potter doing social practice. Yes, he has ceramics training. Does he make functional work? No, he employs really great functional potters who've trained at RISD. And so I think that this becomes an issue in the field in terms of hierarchies of skill, that de-skilled conceptual artists get to employ skilled functional people. And then we've created a hierarchy of skill. that devalues the craftsperson.
So do you think that if this sort of education becomes part of the bigger sort of what your mission of teaching more students to investigate these histories, more PhDs, and it becomes part of the more mainstream, you think that these sort of bridges will come together through that?
Well, I can only train one PhD at a time, right? So I'm also training undergraduates in big, like, if it makes you feel better, I'm teaching 485 undergraduates right now, modern and contemporary art history that starts in 1750. And we do deck arts throughout. I teach them about hierarchy, and they look at porcelain from, the first week alongside French Revolution era painting. So it's, are those kids going to go on to become art historians? No, they're STEM kids mostly. Can I at least introduce them to, like, maybe they'll go to a museum once and be excited? That's what I'm hoping for. I have no illusions.
Okay, so we have a number of questions in the chat now, and I've got them in order. So Jenny, I know, well, feel free to answer as many as you like. And
I just went back there.
Okay, so Katie Fee is next.
Okay, Katie, do you want to read your question or ask it yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, so I was just really interested in what you said about your attention to queer figureheads in ceramics. And that's something that I've been interested in too. And so I was just wondering if you could speak a bit more about how you identify those figureheads when historically so many of them were like secretive and quiet about their sexuality, and that identity wasn't so public.
I think some of it is word of mouth and some of it is research driven. Frances Senska, who I mentioned at the very end, was also, we could say, a queer figurehead, but was never an out lesbian. But she did live with a woman named Jessie Wilbur. They established the Montana State University art department together. She retired early to take care of, they lived together. They invited students over all the time, including Peter Volkus. And they lived together, albeit in separate bedrooms. Which, was maybe the, it's the ultimate I Love Lucy era of the, chaste 50s. But what I find so moving about their story is even though she was never an out lesbian, they were awarded together the Montana Medal of Honor as a couple. So I find that quite moving. And Howard Kotler was a gay man who was out. Garth Clark is an out gay gallerist and ceramics historian. I think that there's plenty of, queering now of the field because we are in a much more celebratory and open moment. But I think you're absolutely right. For a long time, I think it was very hard to be a queer person in this world, in this very hyper masculine world in particular. And I think that a lot of women and queer people were turned off in this field, and also a lot of people of color who were never given opportunities in this field to begin with. It's an incredibly white history. That's also something I touch on in my new book, is trying to go back through the history and find figures who were non-white people who were making work, people of color who did not have the same opportunities or access. And Andy and I were talking about this several weeks ago when we were setting all this up about even in our generation, we're the same age, the amount of people who along the way dropped out as MFAs, women who were given a hard time, maybe queer women, maybe gay people, gay men, but that there wasn't a place even for women in the 90s in the ceramics world, that it was hard to be in an MFA program as a woman as late as the 90s. Andy, do you want to say anything about that?
I thought that was a really salient point that you made when we discussed that, Jenny, just in the sense that I can think of, I think you asked me how many women I had seen not stick with the field. And I don't know that it was something that I had articulated quite that sort of blatantly in my own head, but as soon as you said it, I was completely aware that I could think of easily, more than I could count on my hands. So just in terms of people that I have worked with. So yes, I totally have seen the same phenomenon. Our next person is Marjorie Dial in the chat.
Hi, Jenny. I was interested in, as a historian, how you either move towards or away from sort of the personal relationships that you encounter in your research. You mentioned the Natzlers and Beatrice Wood, and they're kind of falling out. I mean, and as an artist and someone who's running a residency, I really noticed that the rivalries and the personal relationships and sort of the different groupings of people on the West Coast and the East Coast seem non-trivial. They seem important in a substantive way that you'd want to write about as a historian. But how do you approach that?
I feel like a lot of it is hearsay and gossip. And I don't know that you can do it other than that. The queer cultural historian Gavin Butt, who is based in the UK, has a whole book about valuing gossip, particularly queer gossip. And I like that as a theoretical contingency, but I think ultimately you're dealing with a form of gossip that ultimately I don't know that it all stands on its own. It's like, it's intrigue because all human relations are so complex and full of intrigue and betrayal and difficulty. And, I think that in the era in which I'm writing about in live form, there's so many instances of women sabotaging other women because in particular, it was an era in which you had to be the only woman. There was only a place for one woman. There wasn't a place for multiple women. So women did not help other women. And I think that that's something women are past, hopefully now, but those rivalries persist. And I think part of my own investment in thinking through queer women or queer friendships was my hope that the queer women would be more women friendly and more feminist in their dealings. And I don't know that that's true. I would like it to be true, but I think that ultimately people are people. And sometimes people are amazing practitioners and disappointing humans.
Next in the chat is Zach, Zach C.
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah,
Hello.
go for it.
Oh, okay. Hi. Let me just read this really quick. Okay, so you discussed earlier on in your talk about how women were relegated to this role of China painter, or just like this painter on the ceramic body, and that the actual forming and creating of the ceramic object in its inception was left to the studio head, which was male. And then you also brought up how these objects were also a form of monetary control, but also social and political control. But then you showed an image of a catalog from the time period, which would have been targeted or intensely focused towards women at that time. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about this strange crossing of how these objects were initially created by males, but then kind of finished or brought to create their final creation by women and then sold to women in these catalogs, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. So the labor of male throwers and women decorators, it's the history of China painting is something that, for instance, Judy Chicago nods to in her famous dinner party piece, in which she represents historic overlooked women from history as China painting, that they themselves are China painted on the plate. So that would be a contemporary version of China painting that we're not used to thinking through, because China painting is largely still considered an amateur practice. I don't know if there's many contemporary ceramic artists who are reclaiming China painting. Maybe somebody will, or maybe somebody has that I'm not aware of. But in terms of the idea of thinking through craft as a form of social control and sort of having a political circulation, a lot of that does relate to the history of settlement houses and the progressive era in the United States, where programs like Hull House in Chicago, if you've ever heard of that, were established in order to teach immigrant women skills, to offer them skills and also legal services and things like childcare. They were private entities. Hull House was a private entity by two wealthy women, Jane Addams, her partner, both of whom were actually lesbian, as a way to disseminate social services that the government in Chicago was not providing and that the city was not providing. I make an argument in my introduction in live form that these settlement house situations are actually some of the earliest forms of alternative space practice in the United States, because they also provided exhibition space for artists. So I think that there's a kind of interesting lineage there, all the way up to the contemporary iteration of social practice, in which artists re-offer events and social services to the public as a form of artistic practice. So then we come sort of full circle, and I think it's kind of an interesting iteration there. Usually social practice now does not have craft in it all the time, but certainly craft practices have also become social practice. And there's a lot of artists working, craft artists working through social practice now too.
So Ryan Tucker is next, but can I just say, Zach Cervenka, it is great to see you. What time is it in Japan?
Thank you for coming all the way from Japan.
Oh, really quickly, thank you first for that, Andy. But I have just gotten back to attend a grad school program up in Madison, Wisconsin. So I just got back about a week ago. So
wonderful.
Yes, recently in Japan, still acclimating to the time change.
Our last artist talk, he emailed and said he would love to attend, but it was going to be 4 a.m. his time or something like this.
Yeah, pretty early.
So Ryan Tucker, would you like to ask your question, or shall I read it from the chat?
Yeah, I can do that. Sorry, it's like kind of convoluting, and obviously there's one thing in the future, but I'm kind of curious, like, if we think of like Black as being in relation to like repression and the closure of the Bauhaus, and then like thinking about in which like Mills just announced their closure, and then the Oregon College of Art and Craft announced their closure recently too. I was kind of curious, like I'm California, and I left because I had no money, and then now I live here, and I've had friends who went to school in Santa Barbara, for example, and I was kind of curious as to what your kind of understanding is on the ground about like the sort of prospects of craft, especially in like a state that is so interested in like tech boom, which seems to be very much like outside of governmental intervention, like WPA, or even like the sort of monetary dump that happens after World War II. So I'm kind of curious like what your feelings are about that. That's too vague.
Yeah, no, it's real. California is a super expensive place. Santa Barbara is not a good place for young emerging artists to set up. We have a hard time keeping artists in this town. So the artist culture is sort of the Sunday painter set, the people who are still doing plein air painting a century and a half later on the coast with their easels. They're the wealthy people who like to do, outdoor easel painting. We have other artists besides that, but not so many. But I will say that Frederick Reed, who was an arts and crafts potter, who is best known for making Fiesta ware in the 30s, he had this same problem in Santa Barbara and stayed here for 3 years between like 1905 and 1908 and left because it was unaffordable. So I take sort of refuge in the fact that we still can't solve this problem of rich people make prices go up in desirable locations on the coast or something. But now, Silicon Valley is relocating to Austin, Texas. So I look forward to seeing what happens to the prices in Austin. And if Texas is able to figure out how to keep things cheap, because that is the one place people can go for real estate that's fairly affordable and inexpensive. But I think that this is something that many artists solve. I think artists are really adept at finding affordable living situations, much more than the average folk. Artists are much smarter and savvier about it. They find space. They find not only a cheap place to live, they also find a cheap studio rent or a way to go in on group studio rent and do things collectively. And hats off to artists who do this, because I think you are an admirable bunch in terms of solving these problems in a much smarter way that's about collectivity, ultimately, and about valuing community. I don't have answers past that, honestly, I'm sorry, but I do think that, artists are leading the pack, which is also why all of the artist neighborhoods endlessly get gentrified, right? Because you all colonize or settle in less than desirable places that then become ultimately trendy because you're so cool that people want to open bars and restaurants and hotels there.
Our next question is from Ben Carter. Ben, do you want to chime in with your question?
Sure. Thank you, Jenny, for the talk. It was amazing, and thank you, Andrew, for sharing all this via Zoom and letting us all be a part of it. The question I have is about the breakdown of the historical record of women in contrast to the actual lived experience of women in the field. So one thing I've noticed is that women have a lot more power in community than they do in the historical record. Like there's some breakdown where, as things are written down, our culture, our history of our culture as a clay community gets less and less diverse, but that's not the lived experience. There is actually a lot of diversity in the community. So do you have any thoughts about why that happens?
I think the historical record is just incomplete. It's an evolving practice to write history. There are so many more makers than there are people writing about making, particularly in craft. I think that this is actually one of the issues in contemporary craft practice, is that there's not enough people who start out as practitioners who transfer to become writers or thinkers in the field. There's too many people making. Maybe people eventually give up their practice and do something else, but I really love the idea of people deciding to become writers and critics and organizers than just giving up their practice and becoming collectors. I feel like there's a space for really doing the hard work of criticism and scholarship in this field in many ways, both regionally, nationally, internationally, and that if people wrote about their own communities from within, you wouldn't have to bring in outside folk to come look at your practice. You'd have somebody from within writing about that practice consistently. And that takes also somebody who has the knowledge of making often. So I feel like that's maybe the next phase of as craft matures into a more varied practice, perhaps. But it's a really good point.
Okay, and we have one question left, which seems about right to me time-wise. Okay. And yeah, so, and this is from Joyce at the Stanley Museum. So Joyce, do you want to ask your question from the chat?
Yeah, thank you so much for the really lovely talk, and just all of the conversation in the chats were really wonderful too. One of the things that I would love for you to talk about is the infrastructure that's required to make ceramics. And it's really one of those things where it's not like you just kind of set up in the field and it can throw or build or whatever. It requires you to build a kiln, so on and so forth. And so, the comment about the kind of gossip and the kind of internecine warfare that happens within the art world anyhow is one thing, but it also does seem to me that it's precisely because of the communal nature I mean, it's fundamentally extended. And oftentimes, unless the artist has the luxury of their own private studio and kiln and wheel, so on and so forth, that that there is a way in which a kind of fruitful gathering happens within the studio. And I totally see your critique of Theaster Gates. But I also do think that there's a way in which something like Dorchester Industries represents a different form of, a kind of socially engaged practice that asks questions about capital and resources and infrastructure. And I would love for you to I would love to get your thoughts on that.
I mean, I think Theaster Gates is a kind of easy target here because he's brought back ceramics to the contemporary art world, who has been so eager to latch on to, it's so easy and great to latch on to a Black social practice potter. It hits so many different categories there. And yes, he's doing interesting and important work. And I give him credit for moving mountains to take resources from big foundations and invest it in the South Side of Chicago. That's an important thing. But I guess, yeah, I agree with you. There is huge infrastructure in craft. It's also some of the first programs and disciplines to get cut within universities. There are so many jewelry, glass, ceramics programs, maybe not ceramics so much, but certainly glass that they get closed. There's been closures over the last 10 years in a lot of places. And part of that has to do with these liability issues of insurance. If we think about how much, in ceramics, how much there's an emphasis on safety because of the high overhead and the insurance and the fear that some, know-nothing dean is going to come in and shut the whole thing down if one person gets hurt. There was a young woman at Yale whose ponytail got caught in a lathe in a wood turning shop. Stuff like that. It's a real risk. But I don't know. I think that the amazing thing about craft for me is that it fosters community because I think it offers a horizontal classroom in which everybody's learning together. And that's one of the things that I think is super important. That's not to say that all art classrooms don't foster communal learning, but I think that there's something particularly important about the way in which craft disciplines like glass, like ceramics, like woodworking, maybe a little less jewelry because you're at your own bench, but it's about people developing skills together and working together and sharing, and you're sharing the same facilities because you can't duplicate, as you point out, these facilities at home. You need the facilities desperately. And it fosters community as a result, and, firing together, and people who are in, who do wood fire. That's like a totally communal 24-hour performance experience of being outside for 24 hours and feeding the fire. And there's nothing like wood firing overnight and people drinking together and, that kind of carousing of celebratory community. I think that this is what craft is really good at. And that's why I really love craft. But I don't have a good answer for you how we can duplicate this or how we can model it, because I think that the tendency is to walk away from it instead of invest in it. I'm waiting for the investment. I think it's still cheaper to invest in craft than it is to invest in STEM. But I'm waiting for it to become STEAM, where we add A and that's art within STEM. But I think that still hasn't happened everywhere yet.
And ceramics on that point seems to be the perfect medium to explore all of those things, precisely because it's so technically and in terms of its chemistry, so complex and rich. But thank you so much for that wonderful talk.
Thank you. Thank you all for this really rich conversation. This has been really great. Andy, go ahead.
No, it's great. I totally agree. I really appreciate everyone's presence and questions, and Jenni, your time. And I just want to remind everyone about the Stanley Museum talk with Joyce and Jenni together on Thursday night. If the Zoom link is in the chat, but if the chat expires and you can't get it, you can visit either the Stanley Museum's Instagram page or the University of Iowa Ceramics Instagram page. You could just search either of our names and you would be able to find the link in posts on both pages. So that is at 5 p.m. Central Time, Thursday evening. And I hope to see some of you back then. We really appreciate, everybody here tonight. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you everybody for being here and contributing to this really great conversation. It's amazing to see so many people all in one place devoted to a conversation and a real hunger for histories of craft. So thank you.
Okay, thanks everybody. And there they go.
There they go.
This is how class is now, right? It's like you log on and they all show up, and then you say it's time to go and they all disappear.
There's usually at the end of my classes somebody who's sitting around who walked away from their computer and are still there.
Yes, right. Totally. Yeah, it's so funny. You know, the other thing that I have that occurs is, and I promise this is water. It wasn't originally.
It would be okay if it wasn't.
Well, I don't know. I never know if it's okay when I'm teaching something, you know? It feels like a gray area.
Maybe not that.
Right. But what they'll do is we'll be doing a critique and they'll say, I made this one and I made this one and it's the same pot, you know, like, and I,
wow.
am laughing.
People pass that off. That's
yeah, well,
that's
you know, it's happened a couple of times, and this is in an introductory throwing course, and you know they're just trying to have the 10 vessels they're supposed to make, and they've got 7 or something, you know,
right.
But that would not happen normally.
Hi, sorry. I just wanted to say hi and introduce myself.
Hi.
I'm Dara Schaefer. I don't know if you saw my note, but I think if I remember correctly, Theaster Gates was a potter. He started as a potter.
Yeah, he studied at Iowa State. He did have some pottery training.
Yeah. I feel like that example of like contemporary artists who are using pottery and like squishing it, like Sterling Ruby is sort of like the perfect example, as opposed to Theaster Gates, who is a trained potter.
One moment.
I think because you take taking a couple ceramics classes, I don't know if that makes you a trained potter or not. I think that's arguable, but Ruby, what's his name? I'm blanking on
Sterling.
his name. Sterling, thank you. He's I mean, he comes out of an art school background too. So he does have, he came out of art center. He trained as an industrial artist. So he also has some training. So,
right.
I don't know if it's ceramics training per se, but yeah, I don't like his work. His work annoys me. It looks like gigantic ashtrays, in a kind of hyper masculine style. But they sell and people like them. People have bad taste. What can I say? Yeah, I mean, I'm not trying to dump on Theaster Gates. I think he's an interesting artist, but I think he's also a perfect example of the problems of hierarchy in this field. That
of established artists,
yes,
who are using clay in an unskilled way. Is your point?
Well, he's sort of set up an atelier, like he has a studio in an old school kind of way of like, he hires highly skilled, trained people who've largely trained at RISD. He hires people out of that program to come work as throwers. Right. That's okay. That's, they get paid. They're not working there for free. They're not interns. I just think it's a model in which it's a fabricator model. We're in this problem of fabrication where many artists who are able to afford large scale or high scale or highly skilled production hire fabricators. We're in this era of fabrication, but who becomes the fabricators, I think, is the bigger question. And I think that those are skilled craftspeople who are fabricators. You know, in California, there are also people who go and work in Hollywood. Those are skilled fabricators too. And some of those people start as craftspeople. You know, you can, but I think that issue of skill being somehow on the bottom, but valued in a certain way is really interesting.
I've actually had two friends work for Theaster, both of which have had great experiences working with him, but also tremendously skilled artists in their own right. And it's always a challenge for me when someone makes that decision, because not with Theaster, but with anyone, because it means that they're necessarily stopping their own work and starting the production of a person who's already established. And I value Theaster's work as well. You know, I think clay is a gentle practice for him in the sense that I think it's mostly relational in terms of, I mean, he's invested in many different types of work, all of which have to do with accessing different kind of mediums around relations with people, the studio, with the environment of the museum. And it's been fun for me to see those people work with him, but also sad for me to see them not make their own work at the same time.
Well, and I also think it also creates a space for young emerging artists to find a place to work, right? I mean, it's really hard to walk out of a BFA program and find work. And to work in another artist's studio means you get a kind of disciplinary training from the ground up where you learn, you learn how to correspond with a gallery, you learn how to write a real email, like you learned all these skills that you never learn in art school. Yeah. Those things are important. You learn how to be a grown-up working for another, working for an established artist. And I think that that's unparalleled and very important. I mean, I worked for Ann Wilson the year I got out of SAIC. She was kind and hired me. And like, I was so excited that, once a week when I was in her studio, like we would, go to Whole Foods and she would buy me a salad that I could never afford on my own. It was like really exciting to have a $9 salad. And that's being like the impoverishment of like a young artist, like the kindness from above of people who are making it. I think artists are generous people in general, even Sterling Ruby. Yes, because you have like a factory of people. Hi, Ashwini, how are you?
Hi, I'm all right, hanging in there. Just wanted to say thank you, and thank you to Andrew Castro too. I wasn't sure, this was open for public, right? I just saw the link and joined in.
Yes, absolutely.
One of the things I kind of keep asking is whether one of the challenges for ceramics could be that there's nothing like, of course, there is a clay community. We all talk about clay community, but there's nothing like one clay community. Ceramics has the habit of factionalizing within the field based on the technical aspects of how things are made. Like cone six firers are one group, soda firers. I was just about to be labeled as a woman who does wood fire for a decade, and then I moved away from it. But I'm just wondering whether that is one of the things which holds us back, as we, even though we think of us as clay community, we are not. And belonging to one community, does that immediately kind of negate you, put you outside of another community? Just something, yeah.
Is that like a form of tribalism, do you think?
I was scared to use that word, but
I've used it for you.
Thank you. Coming from a small town, small village from South India, and then, traveling everywhere, thinking that American ceramics at least has developed vocabulary around ceramics. I land up here and I'm like, okay, I'm having the same kind of tribal conversations in ceramics sometimes. Yeah, this might be for another conversation.
I think it's a bigger conversation for sure.
Yeah,
but I
the
think
word community sometimes triggers multiple complex reaction in me. I love clay. I love the clay community. Yet, I do see some challenges in there. Like if you didn't go to RISD for undergrad and didn't go to Alfred, the usual way of tracking one's career, where does that leave you? Some ways.
Well, I think even the conferences in clay are like that. The people really diss on NCECA because it's got that kind of tribal feel of like, you have to be in Birkenstocks, you go to morning yoga, and you're drinking beer by 4 or something, and you go to all the demonstrations and none of the talks because it's kind of rigorously anti-intellectual there. But they do this great thing where they have like K through 12 teachers, which no other academic conference has ever. So like I give them some credit for that. They invite teachers in from the community and they hold their conferences in really, so-called regional places all over the United States, like, in the middle of the country, like Kansas City, like I went to NCECA in Kansas City and saw like, 2,000 ceramics people descend on, the middle of the country.
Actually, speaking of that, I had another question that I was wondering if you could answer of academia, since you're a Yale person. What do you think about the fact that Annie and Joseph Albers come to Black Mountain College and started and decide not to have a pottery, like very specifically don't believe that pottery is not a program that they want to have in their art school. And then the pottery does come later, but do you think that because Joseph Albers then goes on to be the head of Yale and that's one of the prominent art programs in the country, that in a way his decision, that initial decision, and his feelings about ceramics and pottery have had like a lasting effect in where we are? And I also find it odd because Annie is relegated at the Bauhaus to weaving as a woman, and she is like a craftsperson,
So that's a really good point. There's a larger history in both directions. The first is that they don't start Black Mountain. They come to Black Mountain is already formed when they get there, and there's already an art program. They are bringing with them the biases of the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus closed their ceramics program very early. It was one of the very first concentrations and one of the 3 open to women at the Weimar Bauhaus, which was the first iteration before they move. The Bauhaus moves 3 times in Germany before it's closed by the Nazis. And in the Weimar tradition, pottery, bookbinding, and weaving are all open to women. Those are the 3 disciplines. And by the time they move, before they get to Berlin, they already lost bookbinding and they've already lost pottery. Part of the reason for the closure of pottery is that the master potter dies and they don't replace him. So there's a more complex history, but that's where Marguerite Wildenhain, who's a chapter in my book, trains. She's the only woman master potter with that designation out of that program. And she ends up in California. So she was, really somebody I was committed to. And I was desperate to find correspondence between her and the Alberses because she and Joseph and Annie all overlapped for years at the Bauhaus, and they knew each other. There's no way they didn't. But I think that they didn't like each other, is my ultimate understanding. And I think Annie was also biased against ceramics, and the Alberses did collect ceramics. They collected pre-Columbian ceramics. They developed a pretty amazing teaching collection that they left to Yale. And I think that for her, the hierarchy was that textiles would be devalued if she supported ceramics, which was considered amateur, partially because they were in North Carolina and they saw these big sort of church bazaars and craft fairs that surrounded Appalachia, and where people did go sell work. And there was a history of craft schools that were put in place during the Depression era for economic reasons, to train sort of poor farmers' wives how to make sellable objects, including textiles. But I think it's an interesting, and there's a kind of regional history, and then there's this international history of the Bauhaus that courses through that problem as well. So to me, it's a kind of both and it's a really interesting problem that you've hit the nail on the head about.
So I'm aware that Jenny's been talking for almost 2 hours with us, and this is definitely above and beyond the call of duty in terms of what we've asked her to do. So
this is super interesting. I think I am going to go eat dinner at this point and walk
Okay.
my dog.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. It was so
You're welcome.
lovely to see you in person
Thank you.
after
Well, thank
reading your
you.
books.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Where are you based, Dara?
I'm right now I'm in Ancram, New York, but I'm New York City based. But I know I'm friends with Linda Weinman, who I met at Anderson Ranch, who I think you know. She's also a Santa Barbara person.
I do.
Yeah. And
well, thanks for coming. Thank you, Analia, for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much, everybody.
And
So,
Oriane,
Jenny,
thank you for coming. And Ashwini, thank you all. And Rachel, I don't know you, but it's nice to meet you as well. All right, well, thanks for all sticking around. And I think maybe we're at the end.
Yeah, so
all right,
th-
thanks all.
Thursday.
Thursday. It's like I feel like we're in a grad seminar situation.
Yeah,
now.
right. so Thursday, like 10 minutes before, same thing. We'll check in. Does that sound okay?
Yes.
Okay.
That sounds great. All
Very
right,
good.
and I'll find the link. If I can't find the link, I'll hit you up.
Perfect. Sounds good.
Okay. Take care.
Okay. Well, I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting. Thanks so much, everybody, and have a good night.
Okay. Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.